Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Calypso Cholkidu. I'm the Director of Global Health Policy and a Senior Fellow at the Centre for Global Development and a Professor of Practice in Global Health at Imperial College, London. We live in extraordinary times. Over the past 6 to 7 months, we've been living through an unprecedented health, economic, and social crisis. A global catastrophe many have predicted, and the impacts of which we're living around the world and experiencing to different extents. A vaccine which has been hailed perhaps as the only definitive solution to this crisis, to the COVID pandemic. And there has been unparalleled investment in the science and manufacturing of developing such a vaccine, rolling it out in record time and getting it ideally to everybody around the world. A few of us came together a few months ago, building upon Jack Scannell's piece in the Financial Times in May this year, to try and understand this journey, to characterize the vaccine portfolio, to quantify the uncertainties in the science and scaling up of such a product, and to reflect on what this means for policymakers and for societies all over the world. What are the chances of getting a successful vaccine in the next 12 months? How long will it take to manufacture it at scale? How good a job have governments, coalitions of governments, donors, and supranational organizations done in designing their vaccine portfolios? But why does any of this matter? Well, national payers and taxpayers need to know this information. We are aware, of course, that industry, national governments, Gavi, CEPI, other major players have their own internal models and analyses. But the stakes are just too high, and the information shared so far has been so little and hard to verify and allow comparisons across products and portfolios that such an independent, objective effort without any endowment bias, one that is scientifically rigorous and honest in acknowledging uncertainty, is really badly needed. Not only to drive planning and improve portfolios, but also to help build trust amongst the general public, without which a vaccine will never work, however successful. That said, vaccine hesitancy we will discuss, but it's something we did not include in our modeling exercise, however important it is. Now, today we're sharing our findings with you, including the code for our model and our approach and our conclusions. More will be coming in the next few weeks, including a user-friendly web-based tool to be launched alongside another event dedicated to manufacturing we're hoping to hold in early November. And we hope that this web tool we'll be launching next month will allow whoever wants to input their own data and assumptions and come up with their own forecasts. Because ultimately, this is what we're talking about: forecasts, estimates, informed predictions. We don't have the answers. My colleague Anthony will describe our results in a minute, but a key takeaway for me is that there is no surprise here. Of course, portfolio diversification is hugely important. And by portfolio diversification, we're referring to making sure the vaccine candidates, however promising they may look now, are not all likely to fail for the same reason. And that is hugely important. To diversify, we also need a varied and attractive marketplace. And the way vaccine development is financed and the way vaccines are paid for also determine to some extent the level of diversification. And we've talked about creating a healthy marketplace in our benefits-based advanced market commitment work here at CGD. Our analysis also suggests that we will most probably get a vaccine or more, but it will take time, and at least to start with, the vaccine will not solve COVID for us. We must continue to live with the virus in the meantime, including maintaining social distancing and other measures, whilst working ever so hard, harder even, on better treatments and better tests. And in doing so, we must not overlook the collateral damage in terms of human lives and livelihoods in rich and in poorer countries that our global focus on dealing with COVID is causing, and which is affecting the poorest amongst us the hardest. We need to keep on asking for the data, continue measuring and publicizing and giving a voice to those suffering in silence. Now, this work is a collaborative effort. Medics, modelers, immunologists, management scientists, supply chain specialists, engineers, high-energy physicists, yes. It turns out finding the Higgs boson and simulating a successful COVID-19 vaccine portfolio share a common methodology. All came together to think things through. And today we'll tell you what we found. Now, that's hardly our conclusion. This is work in progress. We want to hear from you. We want to refine what we found, and we need your inputs to do that and ensure it remains relevant. Now, let me set out for you the structure of today's event, introduce to you our speakers. We have an amazing lineup of speakers and panelists. We have Josh Sharfstein to get us started as our opening keynote. Josh is the Vice Dean for Public Health Practice at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and he's the former Principal Deputy Commissioner of the US Food and Drug Administration. Following Josh, Anthony McDonald, my colleague from CGD, who's been instrumental in driving this work forward, will present our results, and Gabriel Jaramillo, the chair of the private sector COVID-19 Vaccine Advisory Council of Colombia and former CEO of the Global Fund, together with former Minister of Health of Colombia, Dr. Ivan Gonzalez, will respond to the findings and share some reflections. And then we'll move on to a panel structure, which will comprise four people, four of the many co-authors of this work, four people who've driven the analysis throughout the past few months. And I will introduce them to you when we get that stage. But I will just mention we have Anthony, Robert Van Exen, Rebecca Weintraub, and Prashant Yadav. And I'll introduce them to you further when we get to that point. They will make short comments, and this will be the opportunity for you to ask questions. We hope we'll have 40 to 45 minutes to do that, so that we have this conversation I think is critically important to have. So without further ado, I will pass over to Josh, who will have 10 minutes to share with us his thoughts on the current situation with vaccine development. We're very grateful to have you with us, Josh. Over to you. I think we might be muted, Josh. Apologies, yeah.
There you go. Well, I was saying thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for organizing this terrific session and for the work that has been done, which is very important. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts. I think when this all started, the idea that this horrible pandemic, the idea that there would be a vaccine to save us was a lifeline. It was a dream that people could have. And now we're getting to the point where we have an opportunity to understand what that really means. And it is not a magic solution. It's not a magic wand that comes to save us and we wake up from this horrible nightmare. Although we all wish it were, that's not the situation. But it is something that can make an enormous amount of difference. It can save so many lives. And the idea of using a safe and effective vaccine and a set of vaccines in the middle of this pandemic is a very, very important focus for the work that all of us need to do. What I'd like to do is talk about how we can get from here to there at a very high level, what the most important tasks are at each stage. How do we get from where we are now to a vaccine really making an enormous difference and saving many lives around the world? The first thing is we need to complete effectively the scientific research in order to know whether vaccines are safe and effective. We have to know not only what works and what's safe, but for whom it works and what populations it works and how well. Those things will only come when the science is there. They can't be, asserted or legislated. And this is going to require some patience, expertise to look at the studies, and a willingness to recognize when things aren't working. And perhaps above all, this stage requires integrity in the studies, integrity in the regulatory review, and a strong commitment to science. And obviously there are some worrisome signs that there are some countries jumping ahead, hoping, letting hope jump ahead of their understanding of vaccines. And I think the most important thing here is really for the science to become clear. The second stage, and obviously work on these stages may happen all at the same time, but this is how I think about the key challenge at each stage is an ability to distribute, make available the vaccine and vaccine acceptance. And this sounds like, to some people, a pretty easy step. We've got a vaccine, you just give it out. Of course, people in the field of global health know how many steps there are, how much implementation and management, how people have to roll up their sleeves and do all kinds of very, very specific, difficult work to be able to take the potential of a vaccine into the reality of vaccination, which actually is the thing that saves lives. And so at this point, I think it's very important for people to have the resources necessary to do that work, the work of implementing with the chain of custody for vaccines that may need to be kept very cold, the work of reaching different communities, as well as the work of engagement, listening to people's concerns, answering their questions, having trusted messengers, talking about vaccination and building trust. So you skip over that step and you have a potential of a vaccine, but not really the reality of what it can do to save lives. A third critical stage is global cooperation. And we know for many reasons that global cooperation is extraordinarily important. Vaccines that some countries are developing may be very good for certain populations, but not others. And by pooling the intellectual resources of the planet, we'll be in the best position to be able to share knowledge across the world and have as many people possible benefit from the correct vaccination. And here, the challenge is to set aside the parochial, fears, concerns, competition, and get people to work together. We are essentially facing a common enemy for humanity. And it's very, very important that at every stage, from the studies to the review to the distribution and to acceptance, that we think of this as a global enterprise, because no country is safe if there are parts of the world where there is an enormous pandemic. I last want to talk about the importance of maintaining our strong precautions against coronavirus spread during this whole process. And this is a very important aspect of the model I understand that you'll be presenting, that we can't let our guard down while these other stages are happening, while we're waiting for the research to come in, while we're building out these distribution networks, because we could have a tremendous problem and loss of life in the interim. And for this, I think this is a little bit beyond politics, because what we're all dealing with is a tremendous fatigue from what we're doing, and it was going to take, potentially quite a long time, at least in our current mindset where we want a vaccine next week, quite a long time for us to really get there. But we can save a lot of lives in the interim, and we need to be able to maintain that persistence. And for that, I would like just to quote Albert Camus from The Plague, who pointed out that there is the virus doesn't care how tired we are. In that case, it was a bacteria, but the virus doesn't care how tired we are, doesn't care how sick we are, having to wear masks or not going to big groups and concerts and things like that. And what he wrote was, what's natural is the microbe. All the rest, health, integrity, purity, if you like, is a product of the human will, of a vigilance that must never falter. And I think our challenge is to maintain that vigilance as best we can, so we can have the minimum loss of life, the ability to do the things that are very important economically, educationally, while we're putting in place the strong protections through a vaccine. So I think that our strength here is science, it's understanding, it's empathy. And I think this important discussion is very important, is going to help illuminate key aspects of the path between here and a vaccine that really helps the world move through this very difficult and unfortunate stage. Thank you very much for a chance to share some of those thoughts. And I really look forward to reading about all the important research that's going on. And I think everybody who's participating today has a role to play in making sure that we are really using the best of humanity to fight this virus.
Thank you, Josh. These are inspiring words, I think, in a difficult time. I do appreciate taking the time to share these thoughts with us. So I would like to ask Anthony now to take us through the actual results. We've released our report, technical annexes. We also have released our code, and we will be releasing a user-friendly web tool, as I mentioned, early next month, so people can actually input their own assumptions. In the meantime, please do read the report if you have the time and interest. Please do get in touch with us for questions, suggestions. And right now, over the next hour or so, we will be collecting audience questions through YouTube, Twitter at CGDDev, CGDev, and email events@cgdev.org. So please do get those questions through. So Anthony, I would like to ask you to take us through the results of this work before we move on to a response and a panel discussion. Over to you, Anthony.
Great. Thank you very much, Calypso. And just let me put up my slides. You should all be able to see these now. So the first thing to say is, as Calypso has mentioned, this was a very diverse team that brought this together. And I am the one presenting the research, but we really could not have done this without a massive collaborative effort, including Robert Van Exen, who will speak later, who's our vaccine expert, Steve Lloyd, who's a physicist who used his infinite knowledge of Monte Carlo simulations to help us build this model, Laura Subramanian, Julie Rosenberg and Rebecca Weintraub, our partners at Ariadne Labs, Calypso, who you've already seen, and Prashant, who are the senior fellows at CGD, who really helped to drive this forward, Adrian Laporta, Jabin Lee, David Reeder and Ron Thomas from Bryden Wood, who did all of the work on the manufacturing side of this, and then Edine Meza and Jack Scannell, who both used their great knowledge on portfolio management and on pharmaceutical investment, and who really were here right at the start of this project. So thank you to all of them, and it's been a pleasure to work with everyone. So what did we do? First of all, we built a model that, using a range of estimates, can try and estimate how long it will take to get a COVID-19 vaccine probabilistically. And we split the vaccines into 8 categories: protein subunits, inactivated virus, attenuated virus, RNA, DNA, and replicating and non-replicating adenoviral vector vaccines, and other vaccines. And there was 20 vaccines in the portfolio where we couldn't determine their platform, so we excluded them. And we split the vaccines also into 5 mutually exclusive funding types: those that had large external funding, more than $400 million in grants or 100 million pre-orders, those that had some external funding, and then vaccines that are taken forward by large pharmaceutical companies, by medium-sized pharmaceutical companies, or by small biotechs and academic institutions. And we looked at vaccine stage of development, whether they're in preclinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And we put all of this information, we collect all of this information in the model, and we come up with a score for how likely each individual vaccine is to succeed. And success is judged as approval by a stringent regulator, or a vaccine that's good enough to be approved by a stringent regulator if it's not being taken forward in a country that has a regulator deemed stringent by the World Health Organization. So that we are not counting on success approval for emergency use, but we which it seems might happen before we get full licensure. And we took all of these inputs and we put them into a Monte Carlo simulation. And Monte Carlo simulation is a simulation where you take probabilistic inputs, and in each simulation, the model decides success based on whether or not, based randomly in line with the probabilities that we put in. So you could have a model that checks how likely you are to roll 2 dices that say 6, and it would randomly choose 2 numbers between 1 and 6 each time. And if both the numbers were 6, your Monte Carlo simulation will give you the likelihood that would happen. And so we built this Monte Carlo simulation that looks at the whole vaccine model and moves forward month by month, and vaccines randomly succeed or fail in each run of the model. And each individual run doesn't tell you an awful lot about vaccine portfolio, but if you combine all of the runs together, you should be able to get an overall picture of what the probability of success is. The model is dynamic. What that means is if one vaccine succeeds or fails, the model presumes that other similar vaccines will be more or less likely to succeed. So for example, if a leading adenoviral vector vaccine is shown to be very good against COVID-19, we would presume in the real world that this would increase the probability or the expectation that other adenoviral vector vaccines will also work well against COVID-19. And so the model rates them upwards. The model can also slows down vaccine phase 3 trials some of the time, because we've told this might happen in the real world if, say, COVID-19 rates drop, and also places limits on the number of phase 3 trials that can happen in the world. Then we have a second model that looks at the scale-up time for manufacturing, and this is things like the amount of time it takes to adapt or build factories so that they can produce the vaccines that our R&D model produces, and then finally a global manufacturing capacity model, and this just looks at the global capacity to produce various vaccines. One of the things that really struck me in this project was how little we actually know about global manufacturing capacity. But CEPI has done a wonderful job of trying to shed light on this area through a survey, and were kind enough to share their information with us, which was invaluable. So we will create this model, and we have created this model, and as Calypso has told us, we will make this publicly available so people can put in any inputs they like into the model, and they will get different results based on their inputs. But we also interviewed 16 experts ourselves to get their inputs for this model, and these are 8 people from industry, 4 people from government, including regulators and people in agencies that are funding vaccines, and 4 people in academia. 3 of the people are leading vaccine candidates, and all of them we're deeply grateful for their time. So what did these experts tell us, and what are our main inputs? They told us that they would expect about a 66% chance that a vaccine in preclinical development would succeed to phase 1. A vaccine in phase 1 has about a 78% chance of reaching phase 2, and a vaccine in phase 2 has about a 67% chance of reaching phase 3. For phase 3, we collected inputs that are different for each one of the vaccine platforms. The platform that our experts liked most was protein subunit with adjuvants. The one that they liked least was DNA vaccines, or actually it's not in this graph, but vaccines that fall outside of these 7 criteria were given a 5% chance of getting through a phase 3 trial. And what we found in general from speaking to our experts is that they think that there's a higher chance of these vaccines going through preclinical phase 1 and phase 2 than is traditionally the case, because there is so much pressure in getting a vaccine quickly. But doing this more quickly doesn't fundamentally change whether or not the vaccine succeeds or fails. And so we would expect a higher failure rate in phase 3 than you would normally expect. Our experts then also anticipated a roughly 3 in 4 chance that a vaccine that is submitted for approval, having achieved phase 3 trials, would be approved. So what does this mean for the vaccines? We used all of this information, as well as the funding criteria and the stage of the development that they are in, to work out a probability of success for every vaccine in the portfolio. And also we collected timeline information, which we used to collect for all of, to apply a timeline to approval for all the vaccines in the portfolio. And what we find is that even the most successful vaccines, there's only about a 35% chance that the vaccine that our model likes most will succeed. And indeed, there is only 2 vaccines over 30% chance. And on the average times that they succeed, even the quickest vaccines are probably 6 months away from success. But fear not, there are 230 vaccines in the portfolio. And while our model is not hugely optimistic about any one vaccine, when you put all of the vaccines together, the model becomes incredibly optimistic that some of the vaccines will succeed. This is a timeline for when we might see the first vaccine approved, according to our model. There's a very small chance the model thinks that a vaccine will be approved in December. And then from January, the chance starts to rise very quickly. April becomes the month where it's more likely than not by the end of April that we'll have a vaccine approved. There's a 79% chance, according to the model, well, say an 80% chance that the vaccine is approved by a year today, an 85% chance by the end of 2021, and by the model thinks that within the next 3 years, there's over a 99% chance that one of the vaccines will succeed. Now, this is based on the inputs from our experts. We also looked at what happens if we run the most optimistic and pessimistic inputs our experts gave us. Which, to do this, we moved all of the inputs up or down by a standard deviation, and we multiplied or divided the timelines by 1.5 in the optimistic and pessimistic. And in the optimistic scenario, unsurprisingly, every run that we did of the model, all of a vaccine was approved. The average number of vaccine approvals in total in the next 3 years goes from 5.7 up to 18. And the median time to approval is January 2021, with 90% of simulations seeing a vaccine approved by March and 99% seeing one approved by September 2021. So if you have very optimistic outputs, the model will give you very optimistic results. However, if you put in more pessimistic inputs, the results are unsurprisingly more pessimistic, and we see only an 81% chance that one of the vaccines in the portfolio will be approved in the next 3 years. About just under 50% of runs see an approval, with the average number of approvals being 1.7. The median time to approval is not till April 2022. And so the point of this, and the point of the model in general, is that it hopefully allows people, when they have views about how long a phase 3 trial will take and the probabilities of different platforms succeeding, it allows you to translate those views in, and you get different outputs. And depending on the views that you put in, you'll get very different results. And we will be making this available in just over a month, so that everyone can see what their perceptions would lead to. We then moved this on to the manufacturing model. And the manufacturing model, we took 4 targets, 3 of them based on the World Health Organization. Target 1 is having enough vaccines to treat all of the medical professionals in the world. Target 2 is all of the people over 65 in the world. Target 3 is all adults with comorbidities. And target 4 is the whole world's population. Now, the reason we need 18 billion for the whole world's population is because the World Health Organization's research is presuming that we'll need 2 doses of a vaccine to inoculate somebody, and that will lose 15% of vaccine doses due to wastage in either transportation, or when a doctor opens a vial, they're not able to use all of the vaccines. And so what we find here is that the median time to approval is late 2021, early 2022. We start to see enough vaccines to reach target 1. Target 2 and target 3 follow on fairly quickly. And the reason for this is that the model thinks that there's a lot of manufacturing capacity for vaccines in the world. So once we start churning out vaccines, we can get to target 2 and target 3 quite quickly. But target 4 will take quite a bit longer, because to reach 18 billion doses, even with quite a large amount of vaccine capacity in the world, will probably take well over a year. And finally, we looked at diversification. We looked, first of all, at on our right, we looked at our ideal scenario. We put into the model, we asked it, what are the best 6 candidates we could get to ensure that one drug is successful, or one vaccine is successful. And we came up with an 85.7% chance of success based on mostly well-funded pharmaceutical products, so all large external funded or large pharma, with 3 protein subunits, 1 inactivated, 1 non-replicating viral vector, and 1 RNA vaccine. And this kind of tallies with the idea that our model likes diverse portfolios. We also asked the model how likely was that the CEPI vaccine would get approved, and they have 5 candidates that they've backed, and the 67%. And Operation Warp Speed, which is the US government's one, is 79%, and they use 6 candidates, so very close to our ideal portfolio. And then we also looked at the chance that one of the vaccine gets approved in a run from each of the various platforms. And the protein subunit is the most likely, with 87%. Now, there are something on the order of 90 protein subunits, so it would not make sense to back all protein subunits to get to 87%. RNA is 47 or 74, inactivated is 55, non-replicating vector is 54, replicating vector is 18. These actually have very similar inputs. There's just a lot more non-replicating viral vector vaccines in the portfolio. DNA succeeds just under 10% of the time, and none of the 4 live attenuated viruses succeeded in any of the 30,000 runs of the model we used, mostly because there is only 4 of them and they've got very low funding. And so that's kind of an overview of diversifying the portfolio. The other 2 things I'd say in diversification is first of all, our experts were not wildly optimistic about the efficacy of these first vaccines. They will definitely be safe, but we might not get vaccines that are efficacious enough to end this crisis. So having a diversified portfolio allows us to get more vaccines so we're more likely to get a vaccine that is highly efficacious, and also one that reaches the different population groups that Josh discussed. And the second thing to say on this is that the manufacturing capacity in the world is somewhat broken down by different types of vaccines. And so having a diverse portfolio of vaccines to come out will allow us to manufacture vaccines more quickly. And we're slightly concerned that there's not enough inactivated viral vaccines in the portfolio. There's only one outside of Asia being pushed forward. And there's a lot of capacity to make those types of vaccines. The final thing to say is that we did not look at uptake and acceptance and rolling out these vaccines. These are huge challenges that we really think the world ought to be planning for and looking at now. Some of these vaccines are highly thermo unstable, and we have not run large vaccination campaigns for adults in most of the world for a very long time. So if you want to know more about this, please read our paper, and I would like to thank our co-authors as well as Ariadne Labs, who are our partner in this, and Bryden Wood, who led all of the manufacturing work. The CGD's comms team did an amazing job of proofreading, collecting, and pulling this paper together. And we're deeply indebted to all of the experts we interviewed, CEPI for sharing their data with us. And there's far more organizations who fed into this that I don't really have time to name, but we really appreciate it. And look forward to hearing your thoughts on our research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. That was great. Anthony's been the mastermind, the key driver behind all this work, bringing us all together and driving the research from the beginning. So very well done. I will pass over now to Gabriel Jaramillo, who chairs the private sector COVID-19 Vaccine Advisory Council of Colombia. And he has with him the former Minister of Health of Colombia, Dr. Ivan Gonzalez, and we're very grateful and honored to have Dr. Gonzalez with us. So they will spend a few minutes sharing their thoughts in response to what we've just presented, and then we'll move seamlessly into our panel. Over to you. Thank you. Gabriel, are you going first, or is Ivan going first? We can't hear you, Gabriel.
Ivan is going.
Okay.
The minister is going first.
Okay. Minister, over to you.
Thank you, Calypso. Thanks to everyone in the panel. It was very, very interesting what we just heard, and congratulations for that effort to all of you. And thanks also to Gabriel. So we're going to split this presentation into two parts. I'm going to start sharing 4 slides of what has been Colombia's performance during the last months, and not in an approach of judgment, but just trying to show what numbers are showing to us and what we understand from those numbers. So this is our current situation today. Excuse me. We have around 835,000 cases, most of them recovered. We still have around 56,000 of active cases, and we've reached pretty much 26,000 deaths in the last months. Comparing this to other countries in terms of cases or deaths or tests per million, we are in the first 10 places in terms of cases and deaths, and between 10th and 20 in the ranking in terms of testing per million people in our country. This is how it looks. I'm not going to get deep in this, but this is how it looks. We have been having a lot of challenges in between July and September, and we have different moments in different parts of the country where we have been getting a lot of cases. So it has not been like just one peak for all our country, but different small peaks in different parts and regions of our country. In terms of testing, we have been increasing our PCR or molecular tests since March, and some part in August, the government decided to change how we were we were giving the incentives for testing, and PCR start to drop down while we authorized the new test of antigen. And though it has not as much as good results in terms of specificity and sensibility, well, for some places and regions in our country, it was very hard to have PCRs. So this has been another way of increasing the testing, but we're still lacking the capability of testing more. In terms of response, there are like a couple ideas of how was Colombia's strategy or response. We started early in January in the preparedness for the pandemic with adequate approaches to epidemiological or frontier or case monitoring and follow-up. We also had the opportunity to prepare our health system. We were able to double the numbers in ICU's beds, for example. And I think it has been like a lack of focus on primary healthcare in a country where primary healthcare is very important. There has been a lot of struggles between the central government and the local governments. And the strategy included an early, since March, prolonged and generalized lockdown. It ran from March to September, almost 180 days of lockdown, with profound impacts in social and economic aspects. A risk communication strategy has been fear-driven, more than pedagogical processes. We've been trying to tell all the bad things about COVID-19, and we're using some kind of social punishments in order to move people to use the mask and to keep safe at their homes. There was this innovation around an app called Corona app that was trying to make an effort in moving big data and tracing, but it was not successful. So I think we lost capability of tracing. As I said before, testing increased at the beginning, but it never reached acceptable levels, and it have been decreasing since August. I think we have been effective in containing and focalizing efforts toward high-risk populations, especially all elderly people. There has been a lot of efforts from the government to give social and financial aid for individuals and organizations. And there has been a lot of work in terms of protocols to adapt organizations in order to keep on moving the economy. So I'll stop there and I leave Gabriel the next part of the presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. This helps ground this conversation, why it's so important. So that's very helpful. Thank you. Over to you, Gabriel, for a few more minutes, and then we'll pass it over to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. After going through this whole process, not as sophisticated as yours, as to how to develop a portfolio of vaccines, it became obvious that it would be very difficult to do that from an individual middle-income country perspective. So as soon as COVAX showed a capability of being able to run and function, we made the recommendation to enter COVAX for the reasons that we all know. Basically, the conclusions of your study are the best reasons for that recommendation. Go ahead, Ivan. Ivan, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. The challenges ahead are very much what has been mentioned and we all know about. But the thing that really concerns me is how rigid the structures of the ministries of health are to be able to respond to the most sophisticated and challenges of COVID-19. lots of stress, lots of fatigue after months of dealing with the politics and the realities of fighting the virus, and at the same time having to look forward and plan for major challenges. COVAX is, I think, the solution for a diversified portfolio, but even COVAX is sort of work in progress, and a lot of questions are open still to be cleared, and that gives space for those that want to do individual transactions to go after them. Colombia has a strong history of structured vaccination, but it has never really bought any vaccines. They're all ordered through the system, multilateral system, all the way up to UNICEF. So here we are with this major challenge in front of us and not being able to be prepared to respond. Go ahead. Vaccine acceptance is a fundamental part, as has been mentioned already, and the communication and confidence building with the population is very difficult to do also from the rigid structures of a Ministry of Health. It's really complicated for them to be able to use all the channels of communication and to monitor every day how confidence is shifting or lack of confidence is shifting, what's worrying people, and being able to respond to that. And then the local regulatory and approval entities and the authorities, the legal framework makes life for them very difficult, but at the same time, they've been dealing with COVID-19 without investing additional funds and resources to be able to sort of deal with COVID-19 over an extended period of time, to deal with approval of therapeutic solutions and vaccines. And you can already see how we will have a bottleneck as a couple of medicines come up for approval and 1 or 2 or 3 vaccines come up all at the same time. It'll be very difficult for those authorities for that authority to function. Poor monitoring of therapeutic solutions. There's too much emphasis on what's happening in the vaccine, but little preparation for therapeutic solutions, and those are sort of left on the side. And then there's still a need for maintaining the diagnostic capacity and testing, as well as contact tracing. And as Ivan showed, as they emphasize one thing, they drop another. And we saw the drop in testing that we've experienced over the last few months. What really my reflection on this whole thing is that there's a business perspective to managing a portfolio of vaccines, and most public sector entities are not ready to deal with that because there's little experience, and clearly we don't have the experience in health ministries to deal with that, and that has become apparent. So buying a vaccine is more like responding a phone call. It's an opportunity, it's an individual transaction, and there is the idea that a sum of those individual transactions provides a portfolio, as opposed to having a strategy in the building of that portfolio, and then a dynamic portfolio. As things improve and get better, then your portfolio moves in one direction. As things start to show some failures and things like that, your portfolio will show in a different direction. And using public sector funds to buy these vaccines really places these public servants in a very difficult situation, because as things go wrong, And a couple of years from now, people will forget the emergency, and they will deal with very difficult legal circumstances. And so all in all, I think having a solution like COVAX for a middle-income country is clearly the best of all solutions. Yet, I think that because COVAX hasn't really, it's not totally set up, let's say, there's enough questions that justify for some governments to go to the public market.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Gabriel. This is, thank you, Minister. And it's great news to see Colombia enter COVAX. I heard Mexico did too. But as you say, buying a vaccine, assuming it gets developed, licensed, manufactured, but getting to the procurement is only the beginning of a long journey, an uphill battle, perhaps certainly for most countries, gaining public confidence and trust, the legal and regulatory processes and capacities, as you described, Gabriel, the logistics, of course, of rolling it out. And COVAX is not an end-to-end solution. Of course, it solves for part of a big, complex problem. So thank you. With that, we'll move into our panel discussion. We've got about 45 minutes. What I will do is I will introduce our 4 panelists, and I will ask each one question to get us going, and I'll ask them to answer briefly in 2 or 3 minutes. In the meantime, please do send us your questions. We're collecting these through Twitter at CGDev, email events@cgdev.org. And I will be getting those from the team and sifting through them and putting them to our speakers. So our panelists are Anthony McDonnell. He's a senior policy analyst. You heard him present our results here at the Center for Global Development. Robert Van Exen, who's an immunization policy and knowledge translation expert. And, Rebecca Weintraub, a faculty director for the Global Health Delivery Project at Harvard. And Prashant Yadav, a senior fellow, also here at the Center for Global Development, an expert in supply chains, and also a professor in SED. So I'll start with Robert, who has been really the core mind in terms of the clinical science of development in our team, and I'm very grateful to him for volunteering his time in helping us get where we got right now. So, Robert, my question to you is, how are the research and development timelines for COVID-19 different from other vaccines? I've seen your work, you've been quoted in New York Times and various outlets, but how do they differ? And of course, there are obvious benefits to speed, but what are the risks that you see, if any? Robert.
Okay, thank you, Calypso. Could I have the first slide, please? And while that's coming up, I'll just comment on the fact that the, okay, so this is a picture of the normal development of a vaccine. And you can ignore the detail. There's 2 points from this. One is that the average time is 15 years. The range is between 10 and 24 years. And the other thing to note is that all of the little segments that a vaccine development goes through are done end to end. In other words, you don't start the next step until you finish this step. And that really is because a lot of money is involved and nobody wants to go on to step 3 and find out that step 2 failed. Okay, so if I could go to the next slide. Now you can see how much we have condensed the process in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic to be able to come up with a vaccine within a period of 2 to 3 years, which is what our model is predicting. And there's really one overwhelming factor that's enabling us to do this, and it's the incredible cooperation and collaboration between government, industry, biotech companies, academic institutions, and regulators. This is unprecedented. I think the last time we've seen that kind of collaboration is in efforts to eradicate smallpox and the efforts to eradicate polio. Having said that, the key factors here are that some of the elements have been either eliminated or overlapped, so that they're happening at the same time rather than happening end to end. And for example, the technology assessment and preclinical development has been essentially skipped because we already had some experience with SARS and MERS, which we were able to use to rapidly move to a vaccine development. And secondly, all of the pretty much all of the 235 candidates for COVID-19 vaccine were already being developed for some other vaccine, whether a cancer vaccine or some other infectious disease. They were already in the early development stage. Companies simply switched what they were doing and jumped into focusing on COVID-19. So a lot of time was saved there. The clinical trials were overlapped, as I said, cutting the time to at least a third just by the overlapping process. And the fact that the pandemic is raging so intently, it's also allowed to shorten each phase by engaging with a rapid enrollment, and the high incidence, of course, is allowing us to determine efficacy much quicker than we would if there was no raging incidence of disease. And to say the last factor that's allowed us to speed it up, scale up was already being done because of the work was being done on other platforms. And finally, manufacturing was sped up mainly due to the financial support from governments to encourage manufacturers to manufacture product at risk. So these are the main factors. And I think in terms of the outcome, we've sped it up, but we haven't necessarily increased the risk. All of about 9 of the major vaccine manufacturers in the world have recently signed a pledge that they will commit to adhering to the regulatory approval practices that were in existence before this process of condensing the timeframes started, and that they will not submit data that does not adequately prove safety and efficacy of the vaccine. So what I take from this is, again, because of the collaboration, we've been able to increase the risks or left out any of the steps in the process. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. So my next question goes to you, Rebecca. Beyond the approval and production of COVID-19 vaccines, what steps should governments be taking now to prepare for vaccine rollout and uptake?
Many thanks, Calypso. And first, thank you so much to the team at Center for Global Development, and particularly Anthony. I was thinking about, in this time of shelter and quarantine, it's extraordinary to collaborate alongside a new team and establish this partnership. Thank you, Anthony. So we think of this model as an essential toolkit for government leaders because of the complexity and necessity of upgrading their vaccine delivery services. And the diversity of the COVID-19 vaccine portfolio reminds us that we are doing 2 things with a vaccine. The first is we're trying to reduce COVID-19 related illness, hospitalizations, and mortality, and the indirect effects of a vaccine to decrease global transmission and restore the global economy. Governments are looking for evidence-based strategies to communicate the knowledge and the uncertainty, not only of vaccine safety and efficacy, but ongoing updates regarding disease transmission and existing population immunity. So to ensure, as Josh said, that vaccines lead to vaccination, we believe governments need now to upgrade their vaccine delivery systems. And here there are 4 interconnected services: distribution, allocation, verification, and demand for the vaccine, promoting vaccine confidence. All of these services require an investment now in data and analytics. For example, for distribution, the uncertainty and diversity of the vaccine portfolio means we have to think about multiple vaccines with varied storage, dosage, and administration requirements. Allocation, with limited supplies, prioritization is a necessity. Committing to the global allocation strategy is vital, and it's ideal to hear today about Colombia's commitment and future strategies to allocate an initial limited supply. In the United States today, in a few minutes, the National Academy for Science, Engineering, and Medicine will finalize its phase guidance regarding equitable vaccine allocation. Prioritization will require updates to public data sets to estimate the priority populations. And third, verification. Interrupting transmission of COVID-19 will require verifying the vaccine coverage of populations, not only to reduce waste and duplication, but also to monitor for vaccine failure. This will require an investment in the technical architecture to integrate identity services into immunization registries. Investing in global standards and modular, secure, biometrically supported digital health technologies will become essential. We're looking at a very diverse set of portfolio regarding the vaccine candidates. We need to upgrade our vaccine verification systems to match. Now, as history reminds us, and Gabrielle did as well, vaccination is a health and a social intervention. Governments needs to upgrade their demand strategies for vaccine confidence. And through the interview process, many of our experts remind us about 3 efforts that we can conduct today to promote confidence and trust in the portfolio. Number 1, as Robert mentioned earlier, stakeholders must be publicly accountable for vaccine safety above speed. Number 2, we must invest in robust safety monitoring systems. And number 3, we have to understand the roots and heterogeneity of vaccine hesitancy. Only then can we tailor our communication strategies. Leaders need to distribute accurate messaging, not only on efficacy and safety, but the timelines. So in parallel with the unprecedented investment in vaccine discovery, the COVID-19 vaccine portfolio requires an urgent, unprecedented investment in the delivery strategies and systems needed to generate vaccine demand. I hope this model and other tools enable leaders to succeed upstream in their planning for vaccine delivery. Dan Heath reminds us, to succeed upstream, leaders must detect problems early, target leverage points in complex systems, find reliable ways to measure success, pioneer new ways of working together, and enable their successes into systems to give them permanence. Eager to work upstream, equipped with this model to prepare for the portfolio of vaccine delivery. Back to you, Calypso.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So let me move on now to Prashant. Prashant, what do you see as the greatest challenge to rolling out COVID-19 vaccines and assuring sufficient manufacturing capacity? Thank you.
Thank you, Calypso. And before I respond to that question, I want to take a few seconds to just reflect on the fact that this project is, in a way, a preview of how evidence generation in the future will occur and the nature of multidisciplinary teams that will have to come together. So we have, PhDs in immunology, physicists, particle physicists, like Calypso said, operations researchers, vaccine manufacturing, clinical development specialists. And the ability to bring all of those disciplines together is our only bet at trying to find answers to questions which have intrinsic uncertainty in them. So I think I want to commend Anthony for pulling us all together and taking our very varying perspectives at times and integrating them in a meaningful manner. It is truly a commendable task, Anthony. Then I wanted to respond to your question. So I think we see a lot of things that have happened for the first time in how we think about manufacturing capacity and sourcing of supplies. Rob mentioned some of them. I mean, most of the manufacturers are building capacity at risk. public agencies have done both through grant contracting and through purchase agreements, incentivize investments in both manufacturing capacity scale-up, manufacturing at risk, and also relieving bottlenecks in supplies sourcing. And by supplies, I mean auxiliary things that are needed, whether it's glass vials or syringes or adjuvants or other things. But one thing we continue to struggle with is that we are solving the manufacturing capacity problem one candidate, one firm at a time. Right? What we need is a portfolio network approach. The same way as our project highlights the need for portfolio diversification, I think we need to think about manufacturing capacity as a portfolio and say, what would happen if a candidate fails? What will enable us to create a rapid reconfiguration facility which can then take the capacity for the candidate which does not succeed and allocate it to a candidate that has succeeded or has shown the safety and efficacy we're seeking? And that requires information, coordination roles that at this point are unclear where they sit in the global governance structures, both globally and even for many national efforts that we see. And I think, so two things come out of that which are worth thinking about and reflecting. One is, how do we address that for the COVID-19 vaccine portfolio? And there is still an opportunity. I think COVAX, other groups working on it could perhaps think about an orchestration coordination role for managing that better. The second is that for a medium-term future, we should think about something like a registry for capturing manufacturing capacity, both for fill and finish, but also for multiple upstream process steps. And having such a registry should then ensure that next time we want to think about the coordination problem of manufacturing capacity, we can do that in a true optimal sense of allocating each successful, unsuccessful candidate, changing and reconfiguring as needed. And so that's one part. The second part is that this is highlighting that a few years ago, many of us who worked on flu vaccine manufacturing issues have been very excited about the fact that we have platform technologies such as the nucleic acid vaccines, and they will give us the ability to do rapid response development and manufacturing. But our model results show that in order to reach the WHO's 12 billion plus target, some of the nucleic acid vaccines are at a clear disadvantage because the manufacturing capacity that is needed for their global rollout and those assets don't exist. So leave aside the challenges of distributing and other things, even manufacturing. So I think we need a more coordinated way to think about how in the world would we have enough manufacturing capacity for upcoming promising technologies, such as the newer platforms we are seeing coming out the first time this time, while at the same time hedging our bets and risks by continuing to have enough manufacturing capacity for what we call as tried and tested platforms, right? And that risk management hasn't occurred thoughtfully enough. And I think I see an opportunity for us to use both the outputs of this project and our ongoing work and conversation, along with CEPI, COVAX, and other national efforts to make that happen both in the short term and certainly for the medium term.
Thank you. Thank you, Prashant. That's very thoughtful. Thank you. And Anthony, I'll turn to you. In the meantime, please, if you have questions, we've received a few, do send them through to us so we can convey to the panel. I can convey to the panel. Anthony, what's your main takeaway from the research? And you've gave us the results, but if there was one key thing that jumps at you, having done all this work, what is that? Over to you.
So what has really struck me is that there's a lot of uncertainty within this space still. A lot of the experts we interviewed really fundamentally struggled to answer questions like, what is the probability that a subprotein unit vaccine will go through phase 3 trials, or how long are these trials going to take? Because research and development is fundamentally about the unknown. If we knew which vaccines worked, we wouldn't have to employ lots of people in labs testing things, and we wouldn't have to run large trials. And so given this huge uncertainty and the uncertainty in manufacturing, lots of these things we haven't put together at scale before, uncertainty about the distribution, uncertainty about vaccine hesitancy, uncertainty about how many vaccines you should put in your portfolio, that we've tried to give some clarity and some direction on this, but we're still operating in this uncertain world where we don't know how long a vaccine will take, and we don't have a huge amount of information about exactly what those answers look like. And we have, I think, done our best to try and clarify some of these things, but ultimately within using what we can do with the uncertain knowledge that exists. And so I think an output of that is that we should continue to invest widely in as many different types of vaccines as we can. We should continue to increase investment into treatments and into diagnostics, into looking at ways where we can use the technology we have to open things up in society, so that we can test and trace people very rapidly, and return to a degree of normality with the knowledge that it might be a while before this goes away, because we really don't know what the answers are yet. And so we want to back as many horses, I guess, as possible.
Thank you, Anthony. Backing as many horses as possible is a good takeaway. So we've got some questions, reflections from colleagues online. I'll turn to you, Prashant, first with a comment on something that arguably we did not discuss in great detail because we didn't actually model supply chain and distribution steps downstream of manufacturing. So the colleague mentions cold chain, electroporation, vials, bags, etc. So all these complex requirements may well push down the chances of the associated vaccines. What are your thoughts on that? And then I'll move on to the next question. Over to you, Prashant.
Thanks, Calypso. So I think, in a way, the outputs from this are an input to a distribution and supply network planning model, which we are yet to do. And I think while supply issues such as do we have enough syringes, do we have enough vials, are more or less resolved through the work that CEPI, Operation Warp Speed, some other agencies have done, I think that the key questions that still remain are, how will the supplies get distributed both globally and within the country? And when we ask the question, how will they get distributed? Some of it depends on what are the supplies? What are the attributes of the product that you are talking about? Is it an ultra cold chain requiring nucleic acid vaccine? Is it a 2 to 8 degree protein subunit vaccine? Or is it an inactivated virus? So I think there again, the outputs and the probabilities from this model can help us do scenario planning and say, if we are to build a global distribution model and an in-country distribution model, what portfolio of products should it look at? And I think it will also allow us to think about variables such as how often do you distribute from the national storage point to, let's say, every vaccination clinic in the country. If it is a vaccine that requires ultra cold chain, we probably will only be able to have cold chain capacity of this nature in a few points in a country, and therefore we would have to do almost daily or at least multiple times a week distribution, which we've never done before for any of the vaccines. If it is a vaccine that can work in the what we call as a routine cold chain, then we can rely on the existing channels distributed with less frequency, which means once every week or once every month. But then we still need to ramp up the capacity of our routine mainstream cold chain. And it's one thing to say we can set up a new manufacturing site for making, using single-use reactors in Maryland or outside of London or in Mumbai, India, or wherever else those sites are being located. But it's another thing to say you go out in rural communities around the world, many of which are off-grid, and then say you are going to increase the cold chain storage capacity by 5x or 7x. That is oftentimes a much more resource-intensive endeavor than we may imagine. And resources here aren't necessarily money. They are resources in terms of people, technicians, staff, installation mechanics, and so on. And we know from the work that Gavi and UNICEF have done on bringing our cold chain for EPI vaccines and routine vaccines to the stage that it is today, how long it has taken, how complex and onerous this task has been. We we only have a few months to start planning that. So I think the next step should be to take the portfolio sort of output from this and start doing those scenario modeling exercises, which some agencies are starting to do, but I think we need to further amplify that.
Thanks, Prashant. Absolutely. So this is, we're looking at one part of the puzzle, and we're hoping that this will be a useful input to other similar analytical exercises that address different parts, and then hopefully bringing it all together. Anthony, how much disagreement was there between experts on the probability of success, and how did you combine these estimates in the model?
So we had a lot of disagreements around point estimates, the kind of quantitative results for probabilities of success, because I think those are areas where experts struggled with. We get a lot of similarity between what the actual commentaries were. But to give you an example, there's two types of adenoviral vectors. There's non-replicating and there's replicating. And some people told us the replicating adenoviral vectors would be less likely to succeed because there's more safety issues. And some people told us they'd be much more likely to succeed because they're more efficacious, because they keep replicating. Now, I'm fully convinced that both of those things are true, but we had to do a lot of work to kind of think through to frame those questions, so that to think through the different types of answers people were getting, and people would focus on different parts of the problem. So I think we could in the future use focus groups to bring more of this out. To answer the second part of your question, we put kind of the mean responses, the average response through our model as our main results, but then we also used pessimistic and optimistic scenarios, which I shared in our presentation, which were built on the most like one standard deviation up and one standard deviation down of the responses we got. And then ultimately, the reason we want to make our model available to the public is because some people out there might have very different responses to our experts, and the experts are what drive the model. And we want to give them the opportunity to see what the world would look like using their inputs.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got one more question on, which I guess builds on what you've just been talking about, Prashant. How long will it take to ensure access for all, taking into account previous vaccine distribution processes and the particularities of the current situation we're in? Of course, it depends what access for all actually means, but perhaps you could reflect on this, Prashant.
Yeah, I don't know if I have the answers to this, Calypso. Only thing I would say is that our model tells us when would we have, or what is the likelihood of having enough manufactured capacity to meet the WHO's 12 billion plus doses target. And that number or that timeline goes into 2023 for having sufficient capacity. And again, depending upon which candidate, it may be sooner if it is manufacturing for more tried and tested vaccines for which we have larger capacity and more of the assets already configured. But I think that the step that happens after that, which means once the vaccines leave the factory gate and have to be distributed, that is still oftentimes a very big bottleneck unless we invest in building those networks now. So how soon after 2023, when we have sufficient capacity, would we have all of the vaccines distributed and in the vaccination clinics? Depends upon, similar to how Rob described many of the things that became very compressed in terms of timelines in the R&D process. Can we put together a similar effort to do all of the things that routinely take us a couple of years and do them in a few months? And if that's the case, then I think we would have, by the time we are talking about the vaccine doses ready, manufactured for global use, we would also have all of the infrastructure needs ready. But that again requires all of that planning to be done now, which the planning is starting to happen or is occurring. But in addition to the planning, we will need resource investments tied to that plan to start happening now. And that's where I think we are still a little bit focused in the global efforts in figuring out how to purchase the vaccines and how to get enough money to buy it. But we need an equivalent resourcing attached to how will we distribute it and how will we build the infrastructure to distribute it. And it's not just about logistics and supply chain. Oftentimes the bottleneck will be the operational ability to create a mass vaccination clinic, hiring the staff, the vaccine administrators, synchronizing so many distinct activities and bringing them together in an orchestrated manner is oftentimes a very challenging endeavor.
Absolutely, absolutely. Rob, if I may bring you in, this is not, I guess, a question we've explicitly modeled, but it's about the strategy for vaccination. Are we targeting, is the thinking to target the most vulnerable or to increase the immunity across the population to then reduce the risk of people catching the virus, something that also Rebecca reflected on, and looking forward to what the national academies will come up with. But over to you, Rob.
Well, this is a good question, Calypso. I've always said what you want to do with a vaccine depends on what vaccine you select. And by what I mean by that is a highly efficacious vaccine can be used to hopefully really limit the spread of the disease or even stop it. And that kind of vaccine could be used to really control a pandemic, open up the economy, and do a lot of things. A vaccine that is 60% effective is not going to do that. And so you have to use it in a way and perhaps use a different target group to use it most effectively. So a vaccine like that might be useful in reducing the spread, but it's not going to stop it. So how else could we use it? Well, certainly one thing would be to provide as much protection as it offers to our most vulnerable population and to our frontline medical people, and approach it that way. But if I had a really highly efficacious vaccine, you might think about using it more broadly in the working age groups to stop the spread and get the economy open, which the economy itself is going to take lives as much as the disease is. And we often need to think about how that plays out. It's not just the disease, it's what the disease does to our entire society. So it's a complex issue, but I think, again, it's a matter of looking at what those vaccines have to offer and like Prashant said, some forethought about how we would use these vaccines. We've got a wonderful window right now while we're waiting for the first ones to come out to start thinking about these things. And that's what we should be doing right now.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Rebecca, a question that's actually was the front of my mind as well, as in fact, as Rob was showing us those great graphs of how the whole process has been compressed manifold. So the question is, can we learn, or what we're doing currently, can it offer lessons for how we do vaccine development and healthcare product development in the future? Do you think these will be lasting lessons that will result in more efficient, more timely ways of producing, getting things to people that need them in the future? Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Calypso, and I'm pleased to try and answer that question. So obviously the quick answer is absolutely, and I think there's just tremendous work that's being done by researchers across the world to document what we could have done. But even in this moment, if we think about the speed at which we communicated the front runners and the media onslaught that happened, that in and of itself will lead to vaccine hesitancy. And the way in which we frame this conversation, this is a portfolio of vaccine candidates. We're going to wait to understand their safety, their efficacy, which vaccine is right for you, considering your risk factors. I think actually shows us how we can pivot as academics and researchers to remind the public that we are here to ensure, as a third party, to ensure that a safe and effective vaccine is delivered to you. And I think that pacing of expectation is actually part of our responsibility to establish trust. And I think we can do that alongside the leadership of folks like Josh and others who've been saying a very clear and accurate message about these timelines to rely on the science, the clinical trial development, and the data that will unfold and become public in the near future. I also just wanted to quickly build upon, Prashant, your comment about the workforce, because I think in many ways, when we look at the allocation principles, both coming out from the World Health Organization and the National Academy, there's an important nod to protect the healthcare workforce. And we've seen this in previous pandemics as well. In the midst of Ebola, the vaccine was made available to protect the workforce. Not only they themselves are at risk, but the risk of transmitting. And that common stance to register and understand who's at the front lines of the workforce, expanding what it means to be part of the global workforce, and protecting the workforce with the vaccine will be, I think, a vital lesson as we begin the delivery of the portfolio.
Indeed, indeed, absolutely. So we're coming to the end of our session, and I wonder whether colleagues online, the panelists, would have any final thoughts before I try and wrap up a very rich discussion. So I will start perhaps with you, Anthony. Any final thoughts, parting thoughts, and then I'll move to the other panelists.
Yeah, my final thought would be that this is kind of the first piece that we have produced in this space, looking at probability of success, and the first time we've tried to model this. And you can never capture all of the complexities of the world in a model. And some of the questions we asked were fundamentally unknowable. How likely is a protein subunit vaccine to get through a phase 3 trial? People are going to have different responses and ideas, and there's going to be different ways we can model this stuff. So going forward, we want to build on this research. We want to continue to update the model as we learn more about these vaccines. And we might want to think about things like the distribution side of stuff that came up today. So if this is something that you're interested in, or you have ideas about how we can do this better, you have inputs that you would want to use, you want to see the code of our model, please do get in touch, and we are happy to expand on and build on this work, subject to time and funding.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to bring in Gabriel and Ivan as well for any parting thoughts, having listened to the discussion. Gabriel?
I think the value of this goes in the business world of great significance for businesses to plan ahead with a perspective of a longer term, a long run, rather than this idea that things are going to be solved by the end of the year with a approval of a vaccine. Extremely useful exercise, and I really congratulate you for doing it and for the courage of doing it in the middle of so much uncertainty.
Thank you very much. Minister?
Thank you, Calypso. Congratulations all. I think it's been a wonderful moment, and as Gabriel said, a very important study. I think it's going to be a hard landing for anxiety, and it's going to be very polemic with optimistics, but that's what the world needs. We have to stop dreaming, as Josh said in his first intervention, and we have to work in non-therapeutic interventions and continue to prepare countries. So this type of information is very useful for governments and for ministers in order to plan what's coming ahead. Thanks a lot, Calypso, and all the team. Congratulations.
Take care and best of luck. Thank you. Rebecca?
Well, just to reiterate, a thank you again for including us, and as physicians and public health professionals, we do think about the integration of the social and biological sciences. And I think this model and this exercise of collaborating is a phenomenal example of what is possible. And looking forward to iterating together as the data becomes both more available, the model will become better, and we'll be able to serve governments more closely. Thank you so much.
Here. Thank you, Rebecca. Rob?
Thanks, Calypso. Again, it's been an honor to work with everybody involved in this. And I think for me, if we did nothing else, and I think we did a lot more, but if we did nothing else, then speak the truth about how long this is going to take and what it looks like. Then we've done a good thing, because now it is a time to strengthen the things that we are already doing as public health interventions, like distancing, masks, and everything else we're doing, and to strengthen and keep going with that. And but secondly, to be, as I think was mentioned by Anthony, now's the time to be working on treatments and other things that we can be doing to reduce the morbidity and mortality, rather than just sitting around waiting for a vaccine to come. I would be focusing some attention on that. Having said that, the interim period while we are waiting for that vaccine to make it down the line is a wonderful opportunity for us to get it right. And as Prashant pointed out, now's the time to think about getting it right when it comes to distribution and getting that vaccine into people's arms. Because quite frankly, 40 years in the vaccine field, the one thing I learned is that vaccines are absolutely useless unless they go into somebody's arm.
Thank you, Rob. Prashant.
Yeah, I think two things that come to mind. One is this model is a start. I think we all acknowledge the further work that can be done. So I think we will look for everybody's inputs. And I think outside of this, the team of people that worked on the SCORE model, if we can truly make this a larger effort where people come and try and change the assumptions and change the data, we will get something useful. And that thing that I'm calling is useful may not be just for COVID-19 vaccines, may very well become a methodology we want to use for looking at new health technologies and new health interventions and portfolios for things. The second thing I want to mention is that while this work has focused on vaccines, as we see the therapeutic pipeline and the portfolio in the therapeutic pipeline expand, including repurposed drugs, new candidates, antibody cocktails, there needs to be similar, doesn't have to be as involved, could be done differently, effort, so that, like Gabriel Jaramillo pointed out, as countries are starting to think about therapeutic options, they have something similar to go and look at. So I think that's another plea. We can be a part of that, but it doesn't have to be only us. Other groups may start thinking about this very actively. That's what I'll end on.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And I'd like to wrap up this session now. A few thoughts from me. As Josh put it when he opened this session, the vaccine is not a magic wand, and our strength is science and empathy. And I hope we can build on those strengths. I'll finish by quoting one of our co-authors, Jack Scannell, who wrote that the important but counterintuitive message is that when one has a great many vaccine candidates for the same disease, as is the case today, estimating and managing correlations in the portfolio can be more important than adding yet another winner. So this is what we try to do, try and estimate correlations, manage perhaps, or empower others to manage those correlations. We have no answers, but hopefully we're in a better position now in terms of understanding and therefore being able to tackle the inevitable uncertainty surrounding our journey to getting to a COVID-19 vaccine. It's not easy. There's limited transparency in sharing progress, and this undermines individuals' trust in the process and the end objective, the vaccine. As Rob put it, a vaccine is absolutely useless unless it gets into somebody's arm. Nationalism also undermines the very notion of hedging one's bets and encourages secrecy and undermines transparency. Global cooperation, on the other hand, is really important, and it's encouraging to see Colombia joining COVAX. Openness and maturity in acknowledging uncertainty, as opposed to incredible certainty that some of our leaders sometimes radiate. And this is not the way to go. So Josh quoted Camus. I'll quote John Donne, who wrote 400 years ago, "No man is an island." Thank you very much for attending our session. Thank you to our panelists for their time and effort, and the absolutely terrific CGD communications and events teams. And take care. Goodbye.